In other news, this despicable murderer will never see the light of day again, says Teal Island Justice, who Devon City man, graveyard shift murderer, Gavin Wheeler, who brutally murdered and stabbed a Teal Island restaurant worker over 90 times to death upon getting out of work late into the night, after he laid a hand in wait for her, and then confessed that he did it multiple times. Yep, I did it. So what? Sentencing him to life in prison. Gavin Wheeler, a 53-year-old man, was infamously dubbed as the graveyard shift butcher, who laid in wait for a 43-year-old worker at a Hungry Shack Inc. by the name of Gina Ifidel, who was working in the graveyard shift late into the night as well as after midnight, mugged her and brutally stabbed her to death over 90 times, with a machete knife into the stomach, neck, and her legs, just outside of the restaurant about 10 or 15 minutes after it had closed up and took off, leaving a bloody trail and footprints and DNA forceps, clearly pinning him to a crime scene, and perpetrator was sentenced to life in the Teal Island prison, plus an additional consecutive years behind bars. On conviction for first-degree willful murder, unlawful possession of a deadly weapon with an intent of an endanger of others, perversion of the other course of justice, for attempting to tamper with the evidence at the crime scene in one of the most brutal murders ever witnessed or seen in recent Teal Island times. Gavin Wheeler was given the mandatory minimum penalty, an alternative to death or life of prison, with no possibility of parole. After he pled guilty to the brutal physical knife attack and stabbing murder, the other charges he faced confessed to his crimes, and went as far as goes to confess to Gina's family members, even going as far as to say, yeah, I did it. I did it. Everyone knows I did it. So what? Which seriously angered the families over the edge and beyond imagination. Consists of dozens of consistent outbursts and disruptive courtroom behavior, and the plea of hearings that will no longer and complex than would they expect for what Gavin did not make any better. Not only confessing, saying, yeah, I did it, now get rid of me, kill me, do me like the system has been doing my whole life, to which Jenna's mother screamed, fuck you, you deserve to die, bitch. And other family members, including her brother and two sisters, had briefly asked to sit outside of the courtroom until they could remain calm again, but returned into the court, more common profession. But as angry and emotional and demanding justice than ever, Gavin is perhaps know how and famous to be one of the most disruptive, intelligent, and barely any Teal Island court has seen in years, and was labeled as the victorious defendant, as just in one point being threatened with a consecutive time behind bars, the judge for contempt of court, who later sentenced him to life behind bars. Not only he has one of the most cruel, sick and twisted human beings ever to inhabit this Teal Island court system and beyond, but this is considered to be the most uncooperative, disruptive, and defiant defendants that the courts have ever seen, and the biggest pain in the rear that the courts have ever seen either, said Eastern Teal Island Regional Attorney for the City of Devon, Valerie Lockingworth, Justice Edgar Carmen Jones II, and Devon City High Court, said that he wouldn't have automatically imposed a death penalty and would have no problem in doing so, mandatory or not, if the case went to trial, although Teal Island is still one of the few Pogo islands without mandatory death penalty, as it was eliminated over a century ago. But the law only permits mandatory minimum alternative life in prison. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty at the time of the grand jury case back in July, when Gavin was linked to the May 2022 murder of Gina earlier this year. The police execution search warrant was granted, and he was hunted down, apprehended and prosecuted, and arrested days later. After discovered that the knife he had used was bent in half, he had an attempt to hide the body and even cleaned up the remains of the scene, effectively meaning that he had perverted, obscured justice, and he was charged with first degree of willful homicide, unlawful possession of a deadly weapon with a malicious intent and prevention of the course of justice. Pogo is a non-American legal term for obstruction justice. According to the police report, Gina Effel, 43 employee at the all-day breakfast restaurant Hungry Shack, was a Pogo's-ian East Coast restaurant chain and that has a rural kick and feel to it. With most of its locations in the southeastern and central parts of the kingdom, it was reportedly stabbed to death within the brutal murder of a machete knife just outside of the restaurant. Not long after closing, Gina worked the night shift like she always does, having worked there since early 2017, and never experienced tension while working there, and never had a bad customer experience minus a few isolated incidents where there were few and far in between, but nothing so hostile or violent that a stab wounds in her stomach, neck, and legs. Who would also have been her murdering her lying down and just wait for her to come outside the restaurant and close up for the night? She worked the night shifts throughout the most of her career, having mostly considered that she was working the graveyard shift and was labeled the graveyard shift murderer. She was waiting pendently reviewing after being upgraded to the assistant manager at the local Hungry Shack chain that she worked at. He confessed that he did at the time of going there before the 20-member grand jury said that, yeah, I did it. Let's cut to the chase. These 20 people knew I did it. You know I did it. The cops know. My family knows. Everyone knows I did it. So I'll go there before 10. Jury members have the pitted jury case. When asked how he pleaded, he said, guilty because I did it, in an attempt to cut the judge off numerous times. I did it, Mr. Judge. I'm guilty. Did you hear me? We know, sir. Okay, great. You made my life so much easier, he said sarcastically. But do you realize you're found guilty in some of the heinous, depraved crimes unimaginable? You took a life in the most brutal, cruel, and wicked, evil way, to which he led. Yep. The families were held together and mourned and holding back with their emotions. But it was difficult as they lashed out later in the proceedings. You have no remorse, do you? Justice Edgar asked. Nope, he said. I did it. I pled guilty. Sign me up, he said, hanging his head down on the floor, then looking up and winking at the judge, then banged his hands together on the counsel table. Chop, chop, let's go. Put me down, you execute me now. I admitted I did it. The judge accepted his plea, but this was beyond disgusted with his cruelty, evilness, and callousness. Prosecutors would eventually announce that they would seek life in prison without parole in the plea of hearing. In the capital case of the Teal Island for a capital felony, punished by the maximum death or minimum of life in prison, the court prosecution determines, followed by the judge's directions, decide whether or not the person is eligible for the death penalty, whether or not the person lives the rest of their lives in prison or dies of punishment. If the death penalty is not prescribed, a penalty for whatever reason, the judge decides whether or not the person can or ever will be released at any point. These strict capital crime guidelines are only included in the most grave and serious crimes like first-degree murder, aggravated cases of assault, kidnapping, terrorism, etc., etc. Gavin took a plea, but used the plea to be spared with the death penalty. But unfortunately, it's used to his advantage, with the prosecutors when questioning whether or not he should be sentenced to death, given how he was using his plea for an advantage. Though due to the reality, he was attempted to actually become eligible for a long time monitoring of 30 years to his life sentence in prison, which would be the minimum. But such a brutal, heinous, and depraved murder like this, it was certainly impossible. But given the brutality and the wickedness and the extreme depravity of innocent human life, the lack of any remorse and flagrant disregard of the innocent life, provided to the judge in the case that it was not hard to decide whether this murderer should spend the rest of his life in prison. With all the circumstances combined, on the top of his flagrant confession, this disruptive and uncooperative behavior, and zero signs of any change of his behavior, his unapologetic actions. No hope for this rehabilitation. The 10th jury member in the case found him guilty with all charges: first-degree willful homicide, unlawful possession of a deadly weapon with malicious intent, and provision of any course of justice on 2nd of September 2022, after a jury deliberation. But it was up to the deaf to next to decide was the only option. So this case could be a life in prison. But it was the judge's decision to decide whether or not Gavin should be released from the prison on a certain date. With the prosecutors and regional attorney's office in the Devon Debris metropolitan area, the grieving families were hoping to be expressively precluded under all circumstances. Back in August, Gavin said during one of the trial hearings said that, "Yeah, I did it. Now get rid of me. Kill me. Do me like the system has been doing for my whole life." To which they laughed afterwards. And then Justice said, "Mr. Wheeler, control yourself." And Jenna's mother screamed, "Fuck you. You deserve to die." And the other family members, including her brother and 2 sisters, began screaming, "You evil piece of shit. You have no respect for any human being on this planet." For the courtroom baffles and had to calm them down. And, however, one of them overheard them saying, "I understand, and trust me, I understand, but please be quiet," said the justice case had to have them take a break outside the courtroom until they would cool down. It was hard as the courtroom was baffled and the security had left a circle around Gavin, as he was under a threat of intentional physical attack by the families. It clearly arranged by not just what they did to their family member, but who was their sister or daughter, and more. The blatant disrespect of them, and the court proceedings in general. Gavin had to be removed 4 times as an attempt to outsmarting and talking over the judge. He smiled and laughed at the judge's face, while looking him at the prosecutors dead in the eye. This evil piece of filth not only has no regard for the innocent human life, including my daughter's life, but has no respect for us. Her family members, no respect for the judge, the prosecutors, or anyone, not even their own defense lawyer, who I've seen looking around, like if she'd prefer to be somewhere else, while he was just laughing, making a fool of himself of a democracy, of the justice system. He has no respect for himself. And you don't even respect yourself, you can't even respect anyone, said a 75-year-old Nina Valentin. He's a disgusting waste of space who has no sympathy, no remorse, no emotion, no nothing. He's an evil psychopath and a murderer, and deserves to never see the light of day again, she added. Ginna's sisters Annabella Fortin and Lykia Pierce said, every time he grinned and laughed. It showed the grin of the psychotic maniac that had made me want to run up there and punch him in the face. He's so disgusting. He's a disgrace to humanity and a waste of space. He has no respect for human life and nobody. He cannot even respect his own lawyer and himself by taking it seriously. He's so evil and needs to be put away forever, Annabelle said, which Lydia responded. Even if you have no remorse, don't take this as like it's a joke. Exactly what he's doing, and he has been doing. It's sickening. I can only hope he never sees outside of the walls of his prison cell ever again. But even if they got his wishes, would the prosecutors also gain their wish after, originally seeking the death penalty at the grand jury proceeding, but during that plea, they sought the minimum penalty for capital felony and death penalty. In cases alternative to the death penalty, thus being imprisonment with life without parole, the verdict was in, and the Justice Edgar Cameron Jones II and Devon City High Court was due to sentence Gavin today, and came to the conclusion that Gavin Wheeler was not eligible to be discharged on a lifetime monitoring from prison. This means that he will not be released by any point in time and will live the remainder of his or her life in prison, otherwise more commonly as life without parole or natural life in prison. Gavin was sentenced to death in prison without parole for the murder of a 43-year-old Hungry Shack Inc. worker, Ginna Edifel, on the night of the 7th of May 2022, and his sentence was amongst the other severe punishments received for the crimes on Teal Island, and this is just a second only to the death penalty. The only other option they could have get with the court to sign was his benefit could have been discharged on lifelong monitoring once he or she has spent 30 years in prison, or could benefit the discharge from a lifelong monitoring the other day. This would mean that the court could order and thus fix an eligibility period for when he has been able to be eligible to be discharged on a lifelong monitoring. After serving a long period than 30 years imprisonment, put up to and including the maximum sentence of 80 years imprisonment, the number of years of a life sentence and the Teal Island is defined as in the first place. The court found that the base of all the proof and evidence of the brutality, depravity, and hideous nature of murderer, and the flagrant indifference to a human life, and utter lack of remorse on the behalf of the defiant. It would be insignificant justice for the families and the victim, and insignificant to the public safety as whole, by providing the defendant with the eligible for discharge on lifelong monitoring after 30 years or longer than 30 years and on to another day further off into the future. Therefore, the court has decided that no other option would be appropriate. Thus, he refuses to fix the eligibility date and the defendant to be eligible for a discharge on a lifelong monitoring. Thus, sentence him to imprisonment in the Teal Island Penitentiary for all the duration of his natural life, without the possibility of being released under any circumstances. For the remaining of the days, his entire life, the justice announced sentencing him a 30-year minimum of non-parole period in prison, or a longer time of period in prison, and effectively nothing less than life, without parole is significant, and punishment for a murder, cruel, brutal, wicked, and depraved committed by a defiant or defendant that has demonstrated inappropriate conduct with the court upon multiple occasions, a lack of respect for himself in the forum, a lack of respect of families in the prosecution, for his lawyer or anyone else. He has shown no signs of remorse. He has shown no signs that he can ever be rehabilitated. So therefore, I have come to the conclusion that his despicable murderer never see the light of day again. And this is my order to put him away behind Teal Island prison bars for the rest of his life, so we will never have to deal with this disrespect. His depravity and his wickedness and his continuing danger pose us to a society ever again, the judge said before he escorted out by the room by baffles and security then learned after. He will remain in prison for life, and this is never getting out. The applausible and delight of Gina's family members and prosecutors in the general public. It's a day of justice for his victim and for the victim's families and society as whole, said the head prosecutor, Palma Jones, who originally sought the death penalty for Gavin, and he was given a total amount of consecutive years in total of his hope of his natural life in prison, since the total of 21 years imprisonment, thus being life in prison. Thus 21 years without parole. Running it consecutively, Gavin Wheeler was the murderer of Gina Adverl, demonstrated at the time of this offense, and he intended to kill her in the most horrible, despicable, and disgusting way possible, and demonstrated during these proceedings that he is totally unapologetic and that confessed that what he did and provided to us what we already know, that he is guilty and his crimes are gruesome, evil, and despicable beyond imaginable. There is no hope for him. He showed a maximum amount of disrespect to the victims' families, to the judge, and to the prosecution, treated like some comedy show, even with the face of him going to his trial for his brutal murders. Gavin has been held accountable for his actions and his lack of disrespect for the single human being whatsoever. He also brought on his own demise, on top of the heinous and despicable crimes, with a fragrance of indifference to human life on top of it. So with that, he will take into disrespect with him to prison, where he will remain there for the rest of his days. Gavin Wheeler will serve his sentence in life in prison, plus 21 years of running consecutively without the parole on the Teal Island Penitentiary in Derby, located in the Derby-Devon metro area, with cell blocks spanning about both cities geographically. He will be in the super maximum security part of the prison. The families all rejoiced when they heard the news, and embraced with tears of both sadness and joy mixed together. Sadness because of their loss, but joy that the murderer, who took the life of one of their own, will never see outside of Teal Island Penitentiary again. For as long as he lives, we are so delighted today, and now today we will go on our business, and our lives. We will never forget Gina, but we will take this with us as a cost of celebration, knowing that the evil man who robbed her from us, we will never see the light of day again. To which they all did a short prayer outside, and the court huddled up and embracing, saying amen. The Teal Island sits down somewhere in the middle of the terms of how intended or how severe its island level crime justice levels, punishing convicted offenders of their crimes. But when it comes to capital crimes, the Teal Island really does not play around when it comes to offenses in particular. Capital offenses are the offenses that literally comes into life, altering the consequences. Because of a capital offense is normally offense or a crime that comes to the possibility of the capital punishment, the death penalty. That is true in many places, and that is also true on the Teal Island. Today's sentencing today has reflected exactly that. And with that, justice was served.